Welcome back. In the last lecture, we took a look at relativism, and in today's lecture, we're going to be looking at something called moral nihilism, and then also within moral nihilism, also something called existentialism, which I believe I've mentioned that before, but we're going to have a little bit more of a discussion on some of the ins and outs of existentialism because it and moral nihilism kind of go hand in hand. And so, looking at these topics today, just trying to get an idea of some of the options that are going to be in front of us for a foundation for morality. Because remember that just like a house or any other kind of structure, if a moral structure, a structure for morality, doesn't have a good foundation, then it's going to crumble just like a building would if it doesn't have a good foundation. So what is the foundation for morality and within nihilism? Sorry, a little sinus issue here. Within nihilism, the answer is going to be nothing, that there is no foundation. And so if you're familiar with the word nil or nihil, in Latin the word nihil means nothing. And so within nihilism, it's kind of a nothingism. Now remember that like the word nihil, that just means nothing, but when you put the ism, the ism on the back end of a word, then it becomes a philosophy. It becomes a worldview or a way of looking at the world, a way of understanding the world around you. And so with nihilism, the idea here is that there is no meaning, there is no value, that everything begins and ends in meaninglessness and nothingness. Obviously, here in this case, they don't mean nothingness as in literally nothing. There's the physical world around us. But as far as a meaningful, purposeful, anything like that, these individuals, these moral nihilists, are going to argue that no such thing exists. All right. So in relativism, in that last lecture we looked at, we said that that individuals or culture, that was the foundation for moral understanding, that was the foundation for moral guidelines. And so what a person believed in personal relativism, or what a culture believed in cultural relativism. But here in nihilism, there aren't going to be any rules that are truly binding, that have any kind of foundation. Rather, there's no such thing as any kind of foundation. There is no, there's nothing under morality that supports it. Rather, it is something that is fully and completely man-made. That is to say that it exists in the mind of men or individuals, and that it really is nothing more than that. And so it's nothing that is truly real. It's an illusion. It's a fiction. And so there's a really good quote that I hope will help you kind of understand this a little bit. This is by a philosopher by the name of Michael Ruse, and here's what Ruse says about morality. And remember, because I'm going to use the word objective in this, remember the difference in objective and subjective. And so objective moral truths in this case, meaning that they really are real, and subjective moral truths in this case, meaning that they're really up to each and every subject, to each and every individual to understand on their own, or to consider, or to come up with on their own. And so objective is outside of a person's opinion or outside of a person's mind. Subjective just dwells in the mind of each and every subject in that case. And so objective versus subjective. And so here's the quote from Michael Ruse. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth, considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something. Ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when someone says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory, right? And so he uses some of those key words that we're talking about here as well. Morality is just an aid to survival, but it is without foundation, right? And so this idea of trying to find this foundation, again, here Ruse understands it, and what he's saying is that all it is in the world is just an aid to survival. And he's talking in a very Darwinian or an evolutionary perspective here. And so what is morality? Well, it's that idea that that if you live according to the rules that a certain herd of individuals have accepted, then they won't punish you. They'll help you. They'll assist you. And so if you don't rape, then they'll, let you marry their daughter, and then you can reproduce, because that's all we are, is we're reproductive creatures. We're reproductive animals, just like all the other animals on this planet. And just like all the other animals that don't have meaning and don't have purpose except to reproduce, then that's precisely what we are. And so all in the world that morality is just an aid to help us reproduce. So we can get along with each other, we can come up with better foodstuffs, perhaps we can have more luxuries, that type of thing, and all of those really just aid in survival, and then they aid in reproduction, right? So there is no foundation whatsoever, really. It's just an idea of these things help us to get along with other individuals who are in our herd, or that, as we live here in this herd, whatever herd that is, and then we coexist with the herds over here, and so we can help us to get along. But nihilism ultimately means nothingness, and so there is no meaning, there is no value, right? There's no meaning, there's no value in anything that we do. Even with the relativists, they said that there was value. They said that that humans at least do have some type of value, and we have the ability to decide what it is that we want to do, or that we believe that we should be or become. And so with the relativists, there was some type of meaning. But here with the nihilists, they're taking it a step further and saying even that small even that type of meaning is it's an illusion. It's nothing that actually exists. So there is no objective value to be discovered within existentialism. It's going to be an atheistic worldview. This worldview goes hand in hand with nihilism. And so here, looking kind of quickly at existentialism, some of the existentialists and what they thought, because that's going to help us with nihilism. There are certain motifs that recur within existentialism. First of all, there's the nothingness. This comes in early in the development of existentialism, and comes in as early as Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche is sometimes called the father of modern existentialism, but existentialism was a type of thinking that went as far back as the ancient Greeks. So it's not like Nietzsche just came up with it on his own. There were some ancient Greek thinkers that many people consider to be existentialists. It's just that Nietzsche is one of those individuals who's much, much closer to us in the timeline, and he begins what's going to snowball after World War II. And so Nietzsche, there writing in the 1800s, is going to kind of begin something that will become much, much bigger later on. And so he's considered the father of modern existentialism. All right, so ultimately, there is no meaning in life. Nihilism is a philosophy of despair in which there is no meaning to human existence. There's no ultimate values in life. Nietzsche said that the ultimate meaning in life is the only ultimate meaning in life is the meaning that you give to yourself. And he said that he valued and he thought that other people should value, say, for example, the arts, because beauty was something that he thought was something that humans could attach themselves to, and he believed that that was useful and good. But ultimately, it really was purposeless and meaningless, because beauty's going to fade, or what's beautiful to one might not be beautiful to another. And so even within that, it's not valuable. And so it's going to fade and go away as well. Nietzsche said that the only meaning in life is whatever you give to yourself, but there's no transcendent meaning. And that key word there is transcendent. And transcendent just means something outside of, above and beyond, that is not included within, in this case, our physical material world. And so the world of atoms for the existentialist is all that there is, and so then there's nothing that stands outside of it that truly has any kind of meaning. So think about atoms for just a moment. Atoms don't really have meaning or purpose. They go here, they go there, and it really makes no difference ultimately where they end up or what their experiences are while they're in one form versus another. We're not too worried about rocks or trees and the experiences they have, or even planets necessarily and the experiences they have. They can go through all kinds of turmoil, and distress, but that's not something ultimately that has any meaning. Why not? Because they're just a collection of atoms, and collections of atoms have no ultimate meaning. Humans are also, therefore, just collections of atoms, and therefore we have no ultimate meaning as well. Human existence came from nothing and will end in nothing. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that no physical universe. What that means is that our existence came into being, and it was purposeless and meaningless when it came into existence at our birth. And then when we die, that will also be meaningless. And then everything else in between our birth and our death also meaningless, that there is no purpose. And so one time my parents were taking a college class and they were reading a novel written by an existentialist, and my mother came back to the professor after she'd finished reading it, and she said, "I hated this book. I kept waiting for something to happen, and nothing ever happened." And the professor said, "Yes, that's exactly the point. The point is, according to this existentialist writer, nothing ever happens. Nothing ever has any meaning. There's no purpose. There's no value. There's no nothing. That's why in the book, nothing happens." So there's that idea within existentialism. So in fact, the writings of the men who are the champions of existentialism are filled with words like despair and dread, because you can kind of see this complete darkness, this complete despair and dread that would exist if this is going to be the worldview of many existentialists, is that, yeah, I mean, if there's no purpose, if there's no meaning, then everything is just nothing. And Camus, an important existentialist writer, wrote that if it's the case that there really is no value and there's no meaning, then the only thing left for us to seriously consider is the question of suicide. Because why continue to exist in a world of suffering when the suffering ultimately has no meaning, it has no value? And so he said that that was the only true question that was left to consider. This idea was championed by Nietzsche, and an idea that compelled him to condemn 19th century people who he claimed were living in what he called a herd morality. And earlier I said that humans, according to this view, are kind of living in herds, and this herd over here, and as long as you're getting along and obeying the rules of your herd, right, then you're doing the right thing. And that really just is because you're surviving and you're helping other people in your herd to survive. And so really thinking of something like a herd of cows, or even if you want to do something a little bit more in the world of nature, I don't know why, but a herd of wildebeests seems to always come to my mind when I think about this kind of herd morality. And so you're existing within it, and all you ever do is really play along with the other wildebeests or the other cows. You do what you're supposed to do, and you don't try to be anything more than that. You just go along with what everybody's telling you. And Nietzsche called for what he called an Uberman, or a Superman. This individual would be someone who would leave the herd behind them, and that they would go out and they would make their own path, that they would carve out their own life and their own rules, and that they would live accordingly. And so he said that this would be the individual who would build his house on the slopes of Vesuvius. Now, with that, Vesuvius is the volcano that buried Pompeii. And so what he's saying here is that the Uberman, the Superman, goes out and he lives his life there on the edge of danger where no one else is going to go build their house. Who is going to go build their house on the slopes of a volcano that's about to erupt? But what he's saying is that all of life really has no meaning anyway. And so now my words, right? I'm saying this is my kind of what I think of when I think of Nietzsche. So Nietzsche did not say this, but I'm saying it. In a sense, go up onto the edge of the volcano that is going to explode, spit into it, and say, I understand that you are about to kill me, but I refuse to live my life like all of these other individuals who are huddled over here, who are also ultimately going to lose their lives to this meaninglessness and the nothingness. Instead, I choose to defy you Vesuvius, or just the universe itself. I defy the universe, and then make your own path, make your own way, and then stand there looking into the volcano and defying it. Understanding that even you defying the volcano is ultimately meaningless, because everything you do in life is meaningless. So this view is perhaps the clearest, the broadest, and the most honest of the understandings of the secular worldview. We'll kind of see why a little bit more as we keep moving forward, but it seems to be very honest, because ultimately, what meaning or what purpose could a universe have if all that exists truly is just the material, biological atoms and the different collections of those material, physical atoms? And so man finds himself here in this existence, but man has been hurled into this universe, right? And so here the idea is that I don't have the exact quote, but it's something like this. It says that one of the existentialists wrote that man has been hurled into a universe where no one is home. That is to say that no one's watching. There is no God. There is no a greater anything out there that is somehow watching over us or caring about us or anything. We were hurled into a blind physical universe that is completely indifferent to our existence. Now, the word there that I like to focus on is hurled, and sometimes it's translated as thrown, but I think hurled is a better translation. Throwing something implies some type of purpose, and so I have a dog, a lab, and sometimes she moves around here behind me. Most of the time she sleeps, but when I go out to try to get her some exercise, she loves to chase a tennis ball, and I will throw the tennis ball. Now, there's a difference in throwing and pitching. When you pitch, you have a specific target in mind. When you throw, as in my case with my dog and the tennis ball, I don't really have a target in mind, but I do have a purpose. And so when I'm pitching, I have a target and a purpose. Say the strike zone is the target, and I'm trying to get the batter to swing. When I am, or at least I'm trying to get the batter to miss when they swing. When I throw the tennis ball, I don't really have a target. I'm not aiming at that thing. I'm just throwing it into a general direction, but I have a purpose, and the purpose of throwing that is to get the dog to chase the tennis ball. So I don't really care what I hit with the tennis ball. What I care about is that the dog then chases the ball. And so there's purpose with throwing. But when you hurl something, this implies a kind of blind anger where there is no target, there is no destination, and there's also that kind of subtle hint of the desire for destruction, and the desire for kind of a pain and yeah, destruction is probably the best word I've got. So when you hurl something, that's what you're after. You're after kind of this blind indifference, but then also with destruction. So within existentialism, hurled is a very good translation for this concept, because that's what humanity is. We've been hurled here. The universe is blind, it's indifferent, and certainly we're going to undergo considerable amounts of pain. So all of these ideas comes with the understanding that the existentialists say that we all have, the understanding that we have that there's always something kind of eating in the back of our minds, because we all know, instinctively, we all know the sense of dread. We have a sense of dread within us, because we all know the nothingness that we live in, and we know the nothingness that we are destined for. And so the existentialists say that we hide with our herd. We run away, and we try not to think about it, because it's there, but it's always eating at the back of our mind. And so we run faster, and we try to hide better, and because we understand that the nothingness is coming. So that dread is always there within us. This attitude of dread and nothingness became more and more pervasive in textbooks and in art in America, mostly within the decades after World War II. Now, it started in Europe, but it came to America very, very quickly, and it took hold in America very, very quickly after World War II. And why specifically after World War II? After World War II, when the Allied forces defeated Germany, they began to go into the different concentration camps, like Auschwitz, of course, one of the most famous ones, and they began to see the atrocities that the Nazis had brought upon many of their prisoners of war, or many of the Jews and Jewish families, men, women, and children, all included. And after they saw how mistreated and how outrageous humanity was being abused, they began to declare, they began to echo. Remember, Nietzsche's the one who said God is dead. And so they began to echo that sentiment and say, no, there's no God. There's nothing out there that's watching us or guiding us or trying to protect us, that loves or cares or anything like that. Rather, it's that blind, pitiless indifference that we see that's so often, that comes out here in existentialism. And so after World War II, that feeling had kind of been around, but it had never really taken root until the abuses of the Nazis was made known. And then it was kind of this whole, how could you deny that all of life really is meaningless and pointless, and that there's no one out there who's home. There's nobody who's watching us. There's nobody that cares or loves or tries to preserve or any of that. And then ultimately there can't be then any meaning or any value, because everything is just material. It's just the material forces around us. So after World War II, that spread like wildfire through Europe, this concept did, and then it jumped over the Atlantic and it came to the United States very, very quickly. And it came to the United States often through the arts, through writing, through novels and poetry, but also through what was called then the theater of the absurd. Okay. And so one of the reasons it spread so quickly is that it skipped over the academics, it skipped over the scholars, and went straight to the population. And so it appealed more to their hearts and their minds of the normal human at home, rather than trying to win the approval of the intellectuals first, and then letting the intellectuals somehow begin to spread the ideas, like we talked about previously, that's the normal pathway. Existentialism just skipped the scholars and went straight to the people. And so that's one of the reasons it spread so quickly, because they could look at humans and say, don't you know that in your everyday experiences, this is precisely what you experience, isn't it? Meaninglessness, nothingness, you go about your lives. You've watched others who've lived, died, went on, and their life was ultimately meaningless as well. So it spread very, very quickly as well. So, all right. So accepting nihilism means accepting that there is no foundation for, the theater of the absurd. There within the theater of the absurd, and this really was a theater, like the plays, remember 1800s, mid-1940s, 50s, somewhere in there. They began to spread this idea of meaninglessness. But there within the theater of the absurd, they began to realize that they were using words to communicate, and that words themselves had meaning, and that what they were doing was in fact meaningful, because they were propagating this idea of existentialism. And so rather, after a while, they began walking out onto the stage, and rather than making any kind of proclamation, which might have some type of meaning, to try to get their point driven home, they began to do something rather than speak. And they said, so all the world, all life is meaningless, blah, 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 blah. And so then one of the actors would come out, and this is kind of odd, so I apologize, but and then they would make this type of motion and sound. And so if you've ever watched Bugs Bunny, right, he does that in some of the skits. But that's what they declared life to be. Life is about as meaningful as yeah. So this meaninglessness, this absurdity that they begin to focus on and begin to spread those ideas. So accepting nihilism means accepting there is no foundation for morality. All actions then are neither right nor wrong, because there's no such thing as right or wrong because there's no meaning, there's no value, there's no purpose. All there is collections of atoms, and that's it. It's one thing to accept this mentally, but it's another thing to begin to apply it to life. It's a difficult thing. You might be able to accept it, that this is true, but then you'll find it's something that's difficult to live out. Anyone who accepts that life is meaningless and that there are no moral actions will have a tough time living out those conclusions. For example, it's hard not to feel wronged when somebody spits in your face. But ultimately, if there is no right and wrong, then spitting in someone's face isn't wrong because there's no such thing. But that's a really hard thing to, maybe you could accept it mentally, but it's a hard thing to try to do, to live according to that concept, according to that principle. It's hard not to feel wrong when somebody steals from you. I don't know what it is. Stealing, yes, but I don't know what it is about being lied to. But lying, somebody who lies to me, it just goes all over me. I hate being lied to. But why would that be the case? And ultimately, if I'm an existentialist, I come to realize that lying isn't wrong. There's nothing wrong with it. And so I shouldn't be offended when someone lies to me because there's no meaning, there's no value, there's no foundation for morality. We're just collections of atoms, and ultimately what happens to us has no meaning. If someone cuts you off in traffic, and in fact even something like, say, sex trafficking or slave trafficking, ultimately meaningless, pointless, has no value whatsoever. So humanity, though, has a very strong sense of actions being either right and wrong. And even in children, we see them very, very early on begin to grasp a concept of fair play. They have the notion of, that's my toy and that person stole it, and then they go and tell some authority figure, hey, they took my toy. And the implication here is, and they never bring out the logical conclusion, but the implication here is very strong in their minds, is that, and that's wrong, they shouldn't have done that. We don't have to teach our kids that. Now, we teach our kids to share, but we don't have to teach them to be offended when someone takes something from us. They have that. I mean, if someone takes their apple, they know that that person should not have done it. They have a very strong sense of that. It's really amazing. But ultimately, if nihilism is correct, and existentialism, then there's no such thing. There's no grounding or value. There's no grounding for these types of moral ideas. So, in fact, like I say, we see that in children. But what's interesting, even with the existentialists, the ones who begin to proclaim this most prolifically after World War II, two of the most important ones, Sartre and Camus, both of these individuals fought against the Nazis in the French underground. And so after France was invaded and conquered, and the Nazis, they took control of them, and they were maintaining control of them for much of the war, there was a strain of French individuals who continued to fight against the Nazis. They continued to do kind of a guerrilla underground warfare. They didn't have an actual army, but they would try to sabotage roadways or railways, or perhaps interrupt supply lines, anything that they could do to try to slow down or hinder or disrupt or cause destruction within the Nazi occupying force. And so Sartre and Camus, although they declared all of these things to be meaningless and pointless and valueless, they spent much of their time and effort and risked their lives to try to bring an end to this Nazi rule. So even within some of the most prolific individuals who were proclaiming this particular worldview, they were having a hard time living it out as well, because seemingly they could have just said, Nazi occupation, non-Nazi occupation, what difference does it make? Everything's meaningless. But instead, they went out and fought and risked their lives. And so it's difficult. It might be easy intellectually to accept this as being the case, but it's really a difficult thing to live according to it. So the part of the trouble here is that those writers had declared that there was no value, and if there is no value, that includes humanity. Humans also would have no value. Since humans have no value according to their theory, what happens to them is meaningless, but obviously they were fighting against the Nazis anyway. So It is difficult to accept that human life has no value, and it's even more difficult to live according to that view. It just seems to be something within humanity that declares that we do have some type of value, some type of meaning, some type of purpose, and so humans tend to see us as taking actions that are praiseworthy or blameworthy. And what that means is that those values must then, those actions must have value. So if a person behaves courageously, then that's praiseworthy. But in order for that to be praiseworthy, there has to be some type of meaning or purpose. Otherwise, it's just someone who did something, and ultimately what they did, say running into a building and saving a baby, ultimately that had no value, it had no meaning or purpose. But it seems counterintuitive. It seems to go against everything that humanity really focuses on and really, really understands. And so think of your most hated political, I'm going to say enemy, or your most hated political personage, whoever it is that you think is just the worst of the worst. If you accept existentialism, ultimately that individual and what they do is meaningless and purposeless, and I mean there's really no reason to hate or dislike or disagree or anything else, because hatred and dislike and disagreement and all those things are meaningful, they're purposeful, they that seems to be that it's tied up, it's innate within those types of experiences, within those types of attitude towards other people. And think then of the person that you think the most of in a political way as well, that you love and you admire. Well, but if you think about that from this existentialist perspective, it's the same thing. It's meaningless, it's purposeless. Everything that they've achieved is pointless. It has no meaning, it has no purpose. It just seems counterintuitive. Now, while intuition certainly is not something that we can use to prove the existence of morality here, if you look at humanity, I don't think it's something that we should ignore either. It may not ultimately be proof for the existence of moral, a foundation for morality, but it seems like it would be absurd for us to simply dismiss it and say, yeah, well, humans have that, but no big deal. All humans, for all time and all cultures in all regions of the world, have had some type of moral ideas that they strove to live according to. And if you remember me referring to the ancient Egyptians there, and the not taking milk from the mouths of babies, and if you look across time to any of the writings that we can translate from the ones who dwelled in North and South America, you'll find that they had moral guidelines and moral stipulations of how they should live their lives. We may not agree with all of them, but they had them. The ancient Assyrians and Babylonians and Persians and the Mongols, as they came across the plains, and the ancient Chinese, the individuals who lived in what we now call India, all of those individuals, and there isn't, since we've developed writing and the ability to record humanity and their actions, even the oral stories that are passed down from the Native Americans in northern North America, even those traditions, they exude morality. I mean, if all humans for all time, in all regions of the world, in all cultures, if they had something that was so powerful that they would tell stories and write law codes, that they would strive to live their lives for or perhaps against these different moral precepts, it's something that at least needs to be paid attention to. It can't be something that we simply dismiss because, yeah, well, and so, and just letting it go. It's very powerful. It's very, seemingly at least, obviously the existentialists would disagree, it's very seemingly meaningful to humanity, and so it's something that should certainly be considered. It is certainly at least something that the conversation should be had about, which is precisely what we're doing. So, again, not something we can just simply dismiss out of hand, but something that needs to be addressed for sure. And so we're going to continue looking for a foundation for morality, looking at a couple more options, and then very, very soon we're going to be getting into the ethical engines, into those moral theories on how we should make a decision between this is right and this is wrong. So a little bit more discussion on foundation, and then we'll be headed towards the moral theories, which will be dealing not with foundation, but instead we'll be dealing with how do you make a decision about what's right and what's wrong, what action you should or should not take. All right, so here in this lecture we've talked a little bit about the nothingness from existentialism and moral nihilism. So as you're going through some of the different exercises that we've got, contemplating the ideas that you're being introduced to, or perhaps you've already heard them before, but contemplate some of that. Try to see where you are. I do a lot more personal reflection and questioning in my classes through dialogue. It's not something we can really do here, but think about these things. Perhaps even share it with someone that you think is at least somewhat intelligent, and try to have a little small conversation for 5 or 6 minutes, and you'll get a kind of an in-depth, more of an in-depth, meaningful, purposeful way to apply it to your own position and to life as well. So that is moral nihilism. Next time we will come back and discuss another of the options concerning a foundation for morality.